Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the Organic IPM Rodents webinar and panel discussion. This will be recorded and posted to my YouTube channel. We're going to start with presentations from Roger Baldwin and Brianna Marnico with UC Cooperative Extension, and then we'll hear from a panel of experienced growers and agricultural professionals. So thank you all for being here and for sharing your expertise in this area. With that, I will hand it over to Roger.
Okay, give me just a second to share screen here. All right, could somebody give me a verbal that they see everything before I get going here?
Looks good.
All right, great. Okay, so good afternoon, everybody. Happy to be here talking today about developing a management plan for gophers, moles, and voles and organic production systems. So starting off, I always like to provide a little bit of background information about the different critters that I'm going to be talking about. So we'll start off talking about pocket gophers today. I'll probably spend more time talking about gophers than the others, but we'll definitely touch on a number of issues associated with all three today. But pocket gophers are one of the two most damaging rodents to ag production in the state of California, probably our number one. They're certainly the most ubiquitous throughout the state. They are a burrowing rodent about 6 to 8 inches in length. They are, of course, rarely seen above ground, though. So for us to know that gophers are present in a particular area, we have to look for some form of sign. And the sign that we're usually looking for when it comes to gophers are their mounds. Their mounds are usually horseshoe-shaped appearance, such as this photo here at the bottom right, with a plug either towards the middle or the lower middle portion of the mound, um, or sometimes it's not overly apparent. But usually, if you look closely at 3 or 4 mounds in an area, you'll see some of them that have the horseshoe-shaped appearance, and that's a good diagnostic to let you know that you have gophers present. Contrast that to mole mounds, which is the photo here at the bottom left. Mole mounds tend to be more conical shaped in appearance, with the plug oftentimes right in the middle of the mound. Another diagnostic I use for mole mounds is I look at the consistency of the soil. If you look at the mole mound, you'll see that it has large chunks associated with it, whereas the gopher mounds tend to be finer soil. So that's another good diagnostic you can use to differentiate between those two. It is important, though, that you can differentiate between moles and gophers, as the tools that we use to manage them are quite a bit different, and the amount of damage that they cause are quite a bit different. For example, gophers are rodents, therefore they feed directly on plant material. So they're much more likely to cause direct damage to crops in that capacity. Moles are insectivores, they eat worms and grubs and things like that. And so they're not generally feeding on the plant directly, so you're not going to get that kind of damage associated with moles. Now, speaking of damage from gophers, the most common form of damage that we usually see is direct feeding on the taproot of the plant, which can weaken and or kill that particular plant. If we're talking about tree or vine crops, we also see girdling damage, usually below ground. And here's a great example of what that girdling damage can look like on a tree. Now, because this is occurring below ground, it's very difficult to tell that it's happening until you start to see a loss in vigor of that particular tree. Now, at that point in time, if you're seeing that kind of response, it's probably too late. So you may end up losing that tree. And if it's happening to one tree out there, there's a good chance it's happening to multiples out there. So you can see pretty substantial losses from gophers in this capacity. The challenging part about it is, though, is that you can have gophers in a particular area for 1 to several years, and maybe they haven't caused this kind of damage. And so you don't think about it, but then all of a sudden they switch over to feeding on the trees, and then you get this kind of damage. So it's a little bit challenging to deal with from that perspective. Of course, their mounds cause all kinds of issues as well. They can kill plants directly just by burying them. We see this more commonly with vegetable crops or maybe something in your garden. They can also increase weed proliferation when they're bringing that soil up to the surface. That brings weed seed with it. So we can see increased problems weed problems associated with gophers. We also get increased soil erosion from water channeling down through their burrow systems. Here's an example of a vineyard where water started channeling down through one of those tunnels and it went all the way down through this entire row, causing pretty substantial erosion issues. They also cause some potential physical hazards. Those can be tripping hazards to folks. They can be hazards to farm equipment, anything along those lines. And if you're somebody who utilizes subsurface drip irrigation, you'll very quickly find out that gophers and SDI do not go well together. When you're using subsurface drip irrigation, this drip tape is buried below ground. Depths vary depending upon the different crops and your different personal preference, but usually it's at a depth that's pretty ideal for gophers. So they start traveling down it and start chewing on it, like you see in this particular photo. That leads to all kinds of leaks, such as an example here in a field. You can tell this tractor didn't know that that leak was there until they drove right into the middle of it. And then you got all kinds of issues associated with it. And of course, those leaks also lead to uneven distribution of water out there, which is a problem. And then fixing those leaks is particularly problematic. Just because you have a leak somewhere doesn't mean that the hole is directly underneath that leak. Sometimes it travels down a little ways, and so it can be very time consuming and very challenging to fix those leaks. So gophers and SDI do not go well together, and it's unfortunate because subsurface drip irrigation is a very effective way of irrigating crops, uses less water, oftentimes leads to higher or increased yields. Now, we're also going to talk about moles today. As I mentioned, moles are insectivores eating worms and insects and things like that. You can tell from this photo that they're quite a bit different than gophers. So gophers being rodents, moles being insectivores. Now, you can tell when you have moles in a particular area by looking for their mounds, and I went through the diagnostics on the mole mounds already. Another diagnostic you can use are these raised uh, linear ridges that they will create above ground. These are feeding tunnels, essentially. They get just underneath the surface of the soil and start swimming their way through that soil looking for worms and insects. They're the only animal out there that's going to create these kind of raised ridges. So if you see those out there, you know you have moles. Now, just because you have moles doesn't mean you can't also have gophers. You can have both. So you do have to still do some additional diagnostics to determine if you have one or both of these species. And we'll also talk about meadow voles today. Voles are sometimes referred to as meadow mice. So if you're more familiar with that term, we're talking about the same thing here. Voles are dark grayish brown in color, usually about 4 to 6 inches in length. The really challenging aspect about voles is that their populations tend to cycle. So what that means is that you can have very low densities of voles for 1 to several years. In fact, you may not even know that you have voles present. Then all of a sudden, when conditions get just right, those populations can really explode in just a matter of 2 or 3 months, quite frankly. And that can lead to situations where you feel like you are literally being overrun by voles. In fact, I've seen some studies particularly in alfalfa crops, that have shown densities of voles of several thousand per acre in some of these explosion type situations. And so you can imagine the amount of damage they cause when they get to those high population peaks. Now, voles do live in open burrow systems. Contrast that to moles and gophers, which live in closed burrow systems. So you're usually looking for mounds with those species, right? But with voles, you're looking for these openings, these burrow openings. These are usually about 1 inch to 1.5 inches in diameter. And then another really good diagnostic that we have for voles are the runways. They have these runways that go back and forth that connect those vole burrow entrances. So that's another really good diagnostic to let you know if you potentially have voles present out there on the landscape. Now, a lot of these burrow entrances may be old and no longer used. So if you need to differentiate between active versus inactive tunnels and burrow entrances, you can look for fresh fecal pellets or fresh grass clippings. That will let you know that they're currently utilizing either that burrow entrance or that runway. And this can be important when it comes to setting traps for voles, and we'll talk about that towards the end of our time here today. As far as damage caused by voles, if we're talking about tree crops, they will girdle the stems, particularly of newly planted trees. We don't see a lot of vole girdling damage once trees get to 4, 5, 6 years of age. There are exceptions to everything. I've seen some mature trees that were girdled, but for the most part, most of the girdling damage is to newly planted trees or vines if you have vines. Now, also important to note that with voles, girdling damage usually occurs from ground level up to 6 to 10 inches above ground. Voles do not climb well at all, so you don't generally get girdling above that line. And also, usually the girdling damage from voles does not occur below ground. So a general rule of thumb is ground level below, its gophers, ground level to 6 to 10 inches above ground is voles. Now that said, I've seen vole girdling damage below ground. It can happen, so you always have to do a little bit more investigation to figure out what's present in your general landscape. But that's a good general rule of thumb. And of course, if we're talking about vegetable crops, they'll feed on any kind of vegetable crops and they'll gnaw on irrigation pipes, drip tape, cables, etc. And when it comes to managing these small rodent, and in this case with moles, insectivore species as well, we do recommend that you utilize an integrated approach. And of course, with an integrated approach, we're talking about the use of multiple strategies. You generally will find better results if you rely on multiple strategies than if you were to rely on any single one approach. And that's simply because not all individuals in a population are going to be equally susceptible to all of these tools. And also over time, they can start to learn to avoid certain tools. Think about individuals that become very wary of going into traps, for example. So having multiple strategies, a multi-pronged approach is going to give you better results than utilizing just one approach. So let's say, for example, you had a gopher problem. One tool that you can use to minimize some of those potential problems is getting rid of preferred habitats, such as what we see in the top photo, and then follow that up with a trapping program to further target some of those remaining gophers. Again, the important point being to remember to mix and match these tools. And I always stress that because as we go throughout the rest of the talk here today, I'm going to start talking about these tools singularly, but you need to think about ways of how you can combine them to maximize the effectiveness of a management program. Now, as far as some of the different options that we have, it varies a little bit depending upon the species that we're talking about. However, it's important to, again, point out we're talking about organic production systems here. And so a lot of the tools that we might typically use in conventional ag, we cannot use in these organic systems. So a great example of that would be the use of rodenticides or burrow fumigants. We might utilize those in more conventional ag settings, but they're not available for any of the species that we're talking about today. Incidentally, there is a rodenticide that can be used in some organic settings, but that's exclusively for roof rats, Norway rats, and house mice. That's cholecalciferol, and it can be used for those rat and mouse species in and around buildings. But that's it. There's nothing certified for organic use, at least that's effective, for these agricultural field settings. Also, you'll see some other tools out here like frightening devices and shooting that, don't list them as being effective. I think you can probably understand why shooting wouldn't be an effective tool for critters this small. Sometimes it is used for ground squirrels. And if you had a ground squirrel problem in an organic production area, shooting is a potential option. Frightening devices really just haven't ever been proven effective, and we'll talk a little bit about that for some of the species later today. And then you'll see a few question marks on this list. The question marks are really there simply to represent that they might be effective in some situations and not in others. And again, we'll talk about that as we move forward. Now, the previous slide that I had was by no means all inclusive. There are some other tools that can be used to manage these critters as well. One of those tools is biocontrol. And with biocontrol, we're talking about the use of natural predators to help control some of these pest populations. When we think about, some of the animals we're talking about today, really the poster child for biocontrol is the use of barn owls. They can be one part of an IPM program for dealing particularly with gophers and to some extent for voles as well. But our next speaker, Brianna, is going to be talking very heavily on this particular topic, so I'm going to leave all of that for her. But I did want to also mention gopher snakes as a potential biocontrol technique. And I bring this up because sometimes, actually quite often, I get questions about the potential for utilizing gopher snakes as part of a biocontrol program for managing rodents. And so if we're going to talk about the potential efficacy of this, I think it's important to keep in mind a couple of things. Those being that gopher snakes are, number one, they're snakes, right? So snakes are reptiles. Reptiles are cold-blooded. That means they do not feed very often. So in fact, the gopher snake might feed only once every 2 to 3 weeks. And when we think about the reproductive capabilities of most of these rodents that we're talking about, picking off one rodent every 2 to 3 weeks probably is not going to be enough to have much of a potential impact on those rodent populations out there. So I wouldn't be rushing right out to release a bunch of gopher snakes on your property. In fact, that wouldn't be legal to do so anyways. But even if you did, it would not likely constitute effective control. Now, that's not to say that we don't want to have them out there. Certainly, every gopher they take for us is one less that we have to deal with down the road. And so it's nice to have these natural predators out there in these areas. But I would not rely on these individuals to control your rodent population for you. Now, another tool that we have that's oftentimes utilized as part of an IPM program for managing vertebrate pests is habitat modification. And with habitat modification, we're talking about altering the desirability of an area for a particular pest species. Voles are a great example for which to talk about habitat modification. In fact, when we're talking about organic production systems, I would argue that habitat modification is probably the most important tool we have for managing vole populations. And that is because voles are very cover dependent. If they don't have cover, then they're susceptible to predation, and then they move on out of those areas or risk getting picked off by those predators. So if you had an orchard, or in this case, a vineyard, where you had some kind of cover crop out there, one way to reduce potential problems with voles is to make sure that the area around the base of those trees or vines, in this case, are vegetation free. That keeps them from being able to linger around that trunk to perform that kind of girdling damage. Also, if you can keep that vegetation mowed low to 2 inches of stubble height or less, that's another really good way to deter vole activity. So here we have an example of one row with abundant cover and another row where it's been recently mowed. So keeping that vegetation low is really important when it comes to managing voles. Now, some of you may also use a weed barrier type cloth for helping to control some of your weed problems, and that's fine for weed control, but realize that if you have voles present in an area, that can greatly exacerbate vole problems because they love that as a cover resource, and now they just feed more heavily on the tree trunks or vines, depending upon what you have. So be cognizant of that fact. I've talked to a lot of folks over the years that had to tear out their weed barrier cloth simply because the vole damage became too bad. But not everybody has voles. So, there's plenty of situations where you don't have voles, in which case it's not an issue, but it's always something to think about if you do have vole populations in your area. There are some things that we can do for gophers as well. Gophers have preferred food resources just like every animal out there. And gophers in particular like nitrogen-fixing plants, and they like plants with large fleshy taproots. So if you have a cover crop that has a lot of clover or a lot of legumes of some sort, just understand that that's an ideal food resource for gophers. And so you may be increasing the carrying capacity of gophers out there in a particular area. If that's a concern for you, you might think about planting cover crops more along the lines of grasses, something that has fibrous root materials rather than something they can more readily feed upon. Particularly those that are nitrogen fixing, which provide all that nitrogen, which they can convert to protein. Now, there are also some cultural practices we can engage in to reduce the desirability of areas for some of these animals too. With cultural practices, that's basically a fancy term for farming practices, right? So one tool that we sometimes see in organic production systems, particularly as it pertains to gopher damage, is disking. So disking those rows to destroy old burrow systems and also to remove some of those preferred food resources. So that's a tool that can be used that can help reduce potential problems with gophers and potentially with voles as well. And then, irrigation strategy is another great example. This video was taken by a former student here at UC Davis, who's a colleague, and I just love this video. It's one of my favorites. You can see all of these different predator species out here in this field that's been flooded. And essentially what happens when you flood a field is all of these rodents have to come up to the surface or drown. And then when they come up to the surface, they're very susceptible. So you see all these different critters out here picking off voles and gophers. But of course, the problem is we don't use a lot of flood irrigation anymore because of water shortage issues. But there are still places where they utilize flood irrigation. And some people maintain the ability to utilize flood irrigation maybe once every few years, once every couple of years or so, for a variety of reasons, but one of those reasons being to help with their rodent management programs. So if you're somebody who still has the capability of utilizing flood irrigation, just keep in mind that it can be a good tool for helping to reduce potential problems with some of these rodents. Exclusion is another option that we have for potentially reducing damage. We'll talk about a few different options. One option that I've certainly heard discussed over the years, and one that we've tried out, and one that some other colleagues have tried out, is essentially fencing. That's involves digging a deep trench, 2.5 to 3 feet deep, and then putting gopher wire down it vertically to try to impede movement of gophers into a particular area. Truthfully, I never really thought that this would work based on some feedback from some other folks in another study that was done a number of years ago. But as soon as we started digging this trench, it became pretty apparent that it really probably wasn't going to work because we already had gopher tunnel systems at 3 feet of depth. So we knew probably it wasn't going to work, and in fact, it didn't work. So, trying to utilize vertical fencing like this is probably not going to be a tool that's going to be very effective for keeping gophers out of certain areas. But we do regularly utilize raised flower beds, right? For keeping gophers out of certain areas. In this case, you have wooden slats that extend above ground that keep gophers from moving into that bed. And that's important because gophers do get up above ground and move occasionally, not a lot, but occasionally. And if you don't have that above ground barrier, they can definitely find their way into a certain spot. And then we utilize gopher wire underneath. Gopher wire usually being about 3/4 inch mesh seems to be about the ideal size. You can get away with 1/2 inch. Once you get up to 1 inch or so, it gets a little bit iffy. The gopher sometimes can squeeze through that, but maybe up to 1 inch. Certainly, I'd recommend utilizing either galvanized or even better yet, stainless steel wire mesh so that it doesn't rust through very quickly because you don't want to have to redo this process every few years. So that works, certainly in a backyard setting, but on a smaller production scale, if you can utilize something along these lines, and that's a way that you can keep gophers out of certain areas. Incidentally, it works for moles too. And then wire baskets are sometimes used around the root systems of newly planted trees. Again, it's, kind of expensive to do that, time consuming to do that for a whole bunch of trees. But if you just had a few trees that you were trying to protect, then that's a way that we could utilize exclusion for gophers. But ultimately, excluding gophers is a challenge, particularly over larger areas. For voles, we more commonly utilize exclusion. One of the most common ways is through trunk protectors. This helps to eliminate the girdling damage that we see on those newly planted trees. Trunk protectors are usually hard plastic. The key with utilizing these trunk protectors, though, is that you do need to bury them below ground or push them into the ground, depending upon how soft the soil is. They need to go 5 to 6 inches below ground. If you just place them right on the surface of the soil, then what can happen is the vole can climb up inside that, and now you've actually kind of created a perfect environment where they can feed on the cambium layer of that tree as a food resource while also having the shelter from that cover. So we've actually seen some situations where voles will cause more damage in areas where tree or trunk protectors were utilized improperly than if they weren't used at all. So make sure if you're going to use them that you utilize them properly. And we've also looked at the potential to utilize fencing to keep voles out of certain areas. This work actually originated in Monterey County in artichoke production fields. The artichokes were perennial crops, and they would harvest artichokes from them for a number of months throughout the year. But then come late spring, early summer, they would go through and mow and chop down those fields. And when that happens, then there's no vegetation left out there. Well, voles love these artichoke fields, but once the vegetation was removed, they had no reason to be there anymore. And so then they would move to these adjacent natural areas, such as what we see here in this top right photo. And then as the artichokes started growing up again, they'd move back out into those artichoke fields. And so we got to thinking, well, what if we put up some kind of barrier to slow that movement back into those artichoke fields? And so we looked at a number of different products, including some black plastic mesh, some plastic, hard plastic, and then this aluminum flashing, such as what you see here in the bottom right photo. And I actually personally prefer the aluminum flashing for a few reasons. Number one, it lasts out there for a number of years. And number two, it serves as a pretty impenetrable barrier. The vole can't really chew through it. They can't climb up it. So it seems to work pretty well. But if you're going to utilize fencing as a barrier to keep voles out of certain areas, there are a few things to keep in mind. Number one, they again do need to be buried below ground, probably 6 inches at least, maybe even a little bit deeper. And then they need to extend above ground at least 8 to 12 inches. Secondly, you should keep the area weed free for about a foot or so on the side where the voles will be coming from. If you have vegetation, weeds growing immediately around the base of that fence, that allows the voles to linger in that area and figure out ways to dig down or climb up and over the structure. So keeping it weed free will help you out a lot on that front. And then you do have to keep in mind, even with this kind of fencing, you have to have entrance points for farm equipment, right? Trucks, pickups, all those kinds of things. So you have to figure out how you're going to work that kind of fencing type structure, gates, anything along those lines. Ultimately, we found that this kind of fencing approach was pretty good at slowing movement of voles into fields, but it doesn't eliminate movement of voles into fields. It just slows it down. But for us, in this situation, that was enough to allow us to stay on top of the problem. So each situation is a little bit different. But if you have, for example, a natural area next to some of your crop production areas, fencing like this might be a potential option for you to slow that movement. Now, there's also repellents out there that are available. Repellents generally rely on objectionable odors or unpleasant tastes to keep animals away from a certain area. There's lots of different repellents that have been created over the years, including some that are organic. The problem is most of those repellents have generally not proven to be very efficacious. That goes for pocket gophers and voles. However, there is one option that has been tested against eastern moles. So not the moles that we have here. This study actually was conducted in Kentucky against eastern moles. But it it was castor oil, and it did prove to be effective as a mole repellent, at least to some extent. Whether or not it's effective against the moles we have out here, I can't say for certain. But it is certainly something that you could try out if you were looking for an option. Just make sure that if you do get it, make sure that it's certified for organic production systems if you are an organic production system. And I believe that there are some out there that are. But sometimes I'll hear people talk about these vibrating stakes as well, usually solar powered. Whether or not you want to call this a repellent or a frightening device, I'll leave it up to you. What I call them is ineffective and overly priced. So I would not rely on their use. You'll probably just spend a lot of money on something that isn't effective, but certainly you will see them out there. That takes us then to trapping, which if you're an organic producer that has problems with gophers or moles, and to some extent for voles as well, trapping is probably going to be one of the primary tools that you have for helping to deal with that particular situation. So let's start off talking a little bit about trapping for pocket gophers. When it comes to gophers, there's a variety of different kinds of traps that are out there on the market. In fact, a predecessor of mine wrote a book a number of years ago that's probably an inch to inch and a half thick on different pocket gopher traps that have been patented over the last 100+ years. So there's lots of different options out there, but they basically fall into two categories. Those are squeeze type traps, such as like the Victor Black Box, like the one here in the top right, or the Gopher Hawk. Some of you probably utilize the Gopher Hawk, as that's a more recent trap that I see out there and available a lot these days. And then we have our pincher style traps like the Maccabee, which has been around for well over 100 years, probably still the most commonly used type of trap in the state. The Gophinator, which has been around for 15 to 20 years now. The Cinch trap, been around for over 100 years. But there's others like the Victor Easy Set, Johnson's Quick Set, the DK1, wide variety of different kinds of traps out there. Of course, the big question that I usually get is which trap is the most effective? There's certainly been a number of studies that have been conducted over the years on this, including one fairly large study that I was involved with a number of years ago that compared particularly the Gophinator trap to the Maccabee trap. And what we ended up finding out is that the Gophinator trap was actually the more effective trap of the two. And that's what the data here at the bottom left is showcasing. Along the x-axis, what we have are different size classes for gophers. Along the y-axis, we have capture rates. And that's broken down by the two different types of traps, the Gophinator represented by the solid line and the Maccabee by the dashed line. And what you see in this particular figure here is that for the smallest size class in gopher, it didn't matter which trap we used. Both were equally effective. In fact, I think we caught exactly the same number in both of the traps. But as you got into the larger and larger size classes of gophers, we started to capture proportionally more and more. And in fact, that relationship was almost completely linear, such as what you see here in the top right part of this figure. What this essentially means is that for each size class up in size that we had for gophers, we caught about 23% more when utilizing the Gophinator. And that compounded. So for each size class up, that disparity got greater and greater. To the point when we were getting out to the largest size class in gophers, we were still catching them with the Gophinator, but no longer catching any at all with the Maccabee. So for me personally, based on the results of our study, we've had a ton of success with the Gophinator. And that's the trap that I've utilized in all of my subsequent studies from that point moving forward. That being said, I know a lot of people do like the Gopher Hawk. It's a very popular trap these days, but it's a trap that I have not tested. So I don't have any specific data on that. But for these pincher style traps, the Gophinator seems to work really well. Another question I oftentimes get is whether or not it's important to cover a trap set or if you can leave that trap set uncovered. If you cover the trap set, such as an example here in the bottom right, what you're essentially doing is creating the illusion that there is nothing wrong in that tunnel system, so that hopefully the gopher travels up and down it just like it normally would and get caught at a high rate. Conversely, you could leave your trap set open thereby hopefully encouraging investigation of that site. Gophers do not like openings in their tunnel systems. If you create an opening, they will come and investigate and plug that up. And so the theory is maybe you could increase capture success that way by increasing investigation. So we tested that over a large number of areas as well. And what we ended up finding out, honestly, is that it didn't really matter a whole lot either way. We ended up getting slightly higher capture efficiencies during the hottest times of the year when utilizing covered trap sets. But when we considered the amount of time it took to cover and uncover that trap set, we were still catching the same amount per day of whether or not we were using the covered versus uncovered trap sets. And as we moved into the cooler times of the year, so late fall, winter, early spring, which is ideally the best time to trap for gophers, we actually had slightly higher capture efficiencies when utilizing uncovered trap sets. So for me personally, if I'm trapping over large areas, I usually like to utilize uncovered trap sets just because it's a lot easier to set and then check. That being said, if you're concerned about pets or kids having access to the traps, then certainly covering those trap sets makes sense. And you can rest assured that you will have good trap success with that as well. We've also looked at potential attractants. Are there any ways that we can increase capture efficiency? This study basically showed us that you really don't need any kind of an attractant. We used a variety of them. None of them increased capture success to any noticeable extent. Turns out gophers are actually pretty darn easy to catch in traps, and I have other data to show that, but I don't have time to cover it all here today. But gopher trapping, really, gophers are probably one of the easiest, if not the easiest of all the critters out there to catch. There is a learning curve, so I know a lot of you have been frustrated when you go out and trap the first time or two that you don't have success. Trust me, there is a bit of a learning curve, but it doesn't take long before you get to be a pretty efficient trapper. And then we've also looked at human scent. Does human scent impact our ability to catch gophers? Or can we touch these traps and these tunnel systems with our bare hands and not alter our ability to catch gophers? The results of this were very clear. We had absolutely no impact on our ability to catch gophers when human scent was quite active at a site. So don't worry about it. Human scent, not an issue when it comes to gopher trap. So we've talked about some techniques to increase the efficacy of a trapping program, but we still haven't really talked about how efficacious trapping can actually be. Turns out it's a highly efficacious tool. We've looked at this in a couple of different cropping systems, including wine grapes and alfalfa. And there's two noticeable items on this. Number one, you'll see that after a single trapping session, the results were remarkably similar, about 65% efficacy. And after a second trapping session, again, remarkably similar, we had 92 to 94% efficacy. So two trapping sessions, you get rid of close to 94% of your gophers. That's highly effective. So it is a very good tool. That's item number one. But item number two that's important it's an important consideration is this first to second efficacy value. What this shows is that it's really important that when we trap an area that we go through that area 2 times. The reason why is that gophers are not constantly creating new mounds out there on the landscape. Sometimes they may not create a new mound for 7 to 10 days. If they're not creating new mounds, then we don't know that gopher is present. And the only way we can trap a gopher is by trapping in their tunnel system, right? We can't put a trap on the ground and bring them to us. We have to go to that gopher. And to do that, we have to have fresh mounds. There was another study that was done a number of years ago that showed anywhere between 20 and 30% of the gophers present in an area are not mounding at a particular point in time. So even if we go through an area and we catch 100% of the gophers that we target, which won't happen, but even if we did, we'd still be missing 20 to 30% of those gophers out there. So what I recommend is that you follow up that first trapping session by a second trapping session roughly 2 weeks later, and that should maximize the likelihood that you will encounter all or almost all of those gophers out there during at least one of those 2 trapping sessions. So that's important to consider there as well. Talk a little bit about mole trapping too. Again, there's several different kinds of traps out there. There's harpoon style traps, there's choker style traps, there's scissor type jaw traps, and then there's body gripping traps. I will be the first to tell you that although I do consider myself somewhat of an expert on gopher trapping, I do not consider myself an expert at all on mole trapping. So the information I'm giving you here is basically information from others. But the feedback that I've gotten is that the scissor type trap, such as the Victor out of sight trap, is one of the preferred tools when it comes to mole trapping, as are these body gripping traps, like this smaller version of the Gopinator. So this looks remarkably similar to the Gopinator, right? Well, it is very similar, but it's different. It's a smaller version designed specifically for moles. Incidentally, the Sense trap also comes in a smaller version designed specifically for moles. Now, how you utilize these traps does vary a little bit. If you're utilizing these scissor type traps, what you do is probe down into the tunnel. When you find that tunnel system, you then shove that trap down on top of that tunnel. And you want it fairly tight towards the bottom so that there's just a real small gap that the mole can try to squeeze through. And when it squeezes through, it pushes up on that trigger mechanism, which activates the trap. If you want to use one of these body gripping style traps, then they are set just like you would for gophers, where you probe and dig down into the tunnel systems, and then you set those traps in all the directions that the trap is going. The last thing I will mention on this is, again, keep in mind moles are insectivores, which means they're predators. That means they have large home ranges because they have to travel large distances to find all of those different food resources. Because of that, you have to be patient with mole trapping. It might take 7, even 10 days before a mole might come back through that part of the tunnel system again. So when you set a mole trap, you have to plan on leaving it out there for a few days, potentially. Gopher trapping, gophers frequently utilize the parts of the tunnel system that they're still using. So if I don't catch a gopher within 24 hours, I usually pull that trap and move somewhere else. 48 hours max, but for me, usually 24 hours. And the last thing we're going to talk about today is trapping for voles. Vole trapping is not done a lot, right? Voles tend to be quite numerous. So here's just a small example of a whole bunch of holes in one area, one small area. You magnify that up over a large field. How are you going to set that many snap traps out there? Okay, it's just not going to happen. So if you have lots of voles in large areas, it's not a practical tool. But if you have a small isolated area with just a relatively few number of voles, then we can utilize snap traps. Usually what you do is you take a snap trap and you find one of those runways. So here's a runway, lay the snap trap perpendicular over the top of that runway. Then when the vole travels up and down that runway, it runs across the trigger mechanism and gets caught. Voles do not like to deviate off of those runways. They utilize them quite heavily. So you don't need to bait those traps. And that's good because if we bait them, now we have to be concerned about other animals getting into that trap. But if we can leave it non-baited, then that greatly reduces the likelihood that a non-target animal will be caught in that trap. Conversely, if you have just a few small burrow systems or a few burrow systems to treat a small number of them, you can utilize one of these type devices, which works really well. Take a couple of mouse-sized snap traps, stick them down on the ground on both sides of a vole burrow entrance, and then take a piece of gutter pipe and slide that right over the top so that it blocks an escape route on the other two sides, and it forces the vole over the two trigger parts of the trap. That works if you can get all of the vole burrow entrances covered like that. But if you miss one, the voles will just run out of the one that you missed. So you have to get them all. And obviously that's not going to be effective over a large scale. But if you just have, a few burrow systems to treat, then that can be a highly efficacious strategy. So that's the material I have here today. Very quickly, I'll just mention that Margaret Lloyd and I co-authored an extension publication here a few years ago on managing burrowing rodents in organic ag. So if you're looking for more information on that, particularly for gophers and voles, you can find that information there, as well as some information about California ground squirrels. I'll also direct you to the Vertebrate Pest Control Handbook for information on pocket gophers and voles. Keep in mind that these particular chapters were designed for conventional ag, so some of the tools that are in here will not be an option for organic production systems, but it does go into a lot of detail, a lot of background information on these species. And so I think it's useful from that perspective. And then you can always check out the UC IPM pest notes as well for more information on them. And that's the information I have. This is actually 1 day's worth of gopher trapping in a vineyard in Sonoma County. So it gives you an idea of how many voles can be out there in some of these areas. I think we pulled off close to 70 gophers per acre in one of these sites. So lots and lots of gophers in some of these areas. So do we want to do any questions right now, Ellie, or how do you want to address that?
Yeah, thanks, Roger. Let's just do a couple minutes of questions briefly, knowing that we're going to have a panel as well, and Roger and Brianna will both be here for that as well. But if you have specific questions about this presentation for Roger, now is a great time to ask. We'll just take a minute or two. And you can do that by typing in the Q&A box. So when you're looking at the Zoom screen, if you go down sort of in the middle next to like raise your hand right to the left of that. So feel free to put your questions in there, and maybe I'll just wait a minute or two to see if anything pops up. Okay, I'm not seeing anything. So thank you, Roger. Let's move on to
Yep.
Brianna's presentation. Thanks so much.
Yep.
All right, let me go ahead and share my screen. I want to first start with a fun video that is, I'm accessing it on the Cal Poly Humboldt barn owls Facebook page. So they monitor hundreds of barn owl nests in Napa. And while they were monitoring, they captured this video, and let's see if I could get it to play. And so when I talk about hungry mouths, and let me see if I could turn the sound on. Just so you have kind of like an actual visual of how voracious barn owls are. This is like a 2 to 3 week old nestling, and it's almost swallowing gopher whole. And yeah, so they were monitoring the nest boxes with cameras just to get an idea of, you know, when the barn owls were laying nesting, when they're laying their eggs, and they just happened to catch this. So yeah, I love sharing that video. And let me go to my presentation now. Let's see, okay, so I'm going to be talking about managing beneficial raptors for pest control. And so attracting raptors to nest and hunt on farms can boost biological control of rodent pests. And we're going to talk about barn owls for most of the talk today. But I did want to note, and Roger is touching on this a little bit as well, that attracting raptors is one part of an integrated pest management strategy. And I like to describe it as kind of a long-term ecological strategy that you are employing as just a single portion of your pest management program. So one thing to keep in mind about raptors or any predators is that they don't deplete their prey to zero. So this isn't going to completely eliminate any rodent problems, but it can help. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about some research showing how raptors help with pest management. But also, the other thing about attracting raptors is when I say long-term, it's because you could put up nest boxes and it could take a little bit of time for them to get occupied. So if you're having an immediate problem, it's not something that is going to solve that right away. It's just one tool in our toolbox. And yeah, so I want to just kind of start with that general idea. And when we're thinking about integrated pest management, we have the kind of all of these steps. And when you get over here to action, so like Roger was saying, biological control is really just one of our tools in our toolbox for pest management. But actually thinking about, because raptors are these large, long-lived animals that have, slower reproductive rate than a lot of other pests that we're thinking about, you can sort of place this more in a prevention box. So well-maintained nest boxes and promoting raptors, it's, like I said, not going to solve your problem immediately, but what it can do is when you do have another pest outbreak, especially a vole outbreak, or when juvenile gophers are dispersing and starting to run across the landscape and get, back out and populate those fields, that's where raptors are really going to be helping. And so, so let's talk about some of the most common raptor species in our area in Northern California. So that's going to be the barn owl, red-tailed hawks, and American kestrels. So this is just up close with them. But I like to share this table here because in California, we're really, really lucky. We have a wide variety, abundant raptor population. So the thing that I'd like to point out, though, is that most of raptors that we're going to find in our agricultural areas are consuming small rodents as a really large part of their diet. And so we're really lucky to have nesting raptors and some migratory raptors that come in the winter and can help with these rodents. So these are two pictures from a barn owl nest box. So on top we have some cached rodent prey. So this is in an active nest where the barn owl dad hunted way more rodents than the nestlings could actually consume in one night. And so we call this the barn owl pantry. They just have all of these rodents cached. They're just really great predators. And then on the bottom are 4 large gophers that were also found cached in another nest box. So what are they eating and how much do they kill? So for barn owls, we do know that in California agricultural regions, their diet consists of greater than 99% rodent pests, and that they're going to be targeting the common rodent pests. So we found in agricultural areas that had more row crops that barn owls were eating a higher proportion of mice. And in areas where we see more vineyards and orchards where there is likely to be a higher proportion of gophers, there are a higher proportion of gophers in those barn owls' diet. And then it's been estimated how many. It's been estimated that a nesting pair and their young can consume over 220 pounds of prey in a single year. And another study in Napa monitored nest boxes with cameras to document all of the prey that the parents brought back to feed the nestlings. And over a single nesting period, that was 3,000 to 4,000 rodents. So they are consuming a lot of rodents, especially the nesting birds that are around. But they are also influencing prey by just being present. And so we call this the landscape of fear. And so when a predator is nearby, prey can sense that and they get scared and they shift their behavior. So they may feed less, they may reproduce less, and that can in turn result in less damage or less pest activity in your farm. So an example of this is another study done by the Cal Poly Humboldt Research Group, and they looked at gopher mounds as an index of gopher activity, and they found that when barn owl nest boxes were not active, from February to May, gopher activity increased by 18%. But in areas where there were active barn owl nest boxes, in areas where there were active barn owl nest boxes, they saw gopher activity decrease by 14%. And they also just did another study this past year looking at a similar concept with mice and found really exciting results. Our mice and voles also have behavioral changes when barn owl nest boxes are active. So how do we run and manage barn owl nest box networks? The first is to learn a little bit about their natural history. What's really interesting about barn owls compared to other birds, and which makes them kind of the farmer's best friend, is that they have an incredibly long breeding season. In California, they can start laying their eggs as early as January. They can have up to 2 nests in 1 year. And so that could equate for nests being used like late into the summer months. And when they lay their eggs, the female is going to incubate those eggs for 4 weeks, and the male exclusively hunts and feeds her. And when those eggs hatch, he's still hunting, feeding her and the nestlings. And those nestlings take 8 weeks to develop. So this is kind of the period where you're going to have the highest pressure on rodents because of all those hungry mouths. And timing is important for a variety of reasons. In California, we see that the egg laying begins in mid to late February. But that means that prospecting and choosing a nest box and kind of holding territory over that nest box is happening much earlier. So it can be in the winter months when they're kind of in that sensitive period of picking a nest box and deciding if this is going to be a safe place to raise their young for 3 whole months. In the Coast Range out here in this orange area, it's a little bit later than the state average. So they eggs might be later in February or in March, but it's typically earlier in the Central Valley and the Southern California area. So nest box installation. You want to install these. You can really install them any time of the year, but if you get them up by late summer and fall, you're going to have your best likelihood for them to be found for the following breeding season. Like I said, they're not going to necessarily have a nest in your nest box immediately after you put it up. So be patient. It's a long-term strategy. And it could depend on your location. So barn owls are more common in areas that are more open, such as oak woodlands or, places like vineyards, where there's a lot of vineyards like in Napa and Sonoma, but they're not going to be as common in areas that are more heavily forested. And that's just because of their hunting strategy and their nesting strategy. When you put barn owl nest boxes out on your farms, you want to place them in open areas on poles, typically to so they're out in the open where they can be seen and found, and also helps with predators being able to, or other like mammals or other squirrels being able to get into the box and hurt the young or the eggs. If you do have orchards, you could place them along the edge of orchards, so or in vineyards. Or typically vineyards I consider like an open kind of area. And then again, avoid dense forests unless you're putting them closer to the edge, but there could be less barn owls in those areas. Don't place them near busy roads or roads that are not very busy but have very fast speed limits, like some county roads. And then houses, they could be pretty loud. And sometimes it could be disturbing for people who are sleeping. You like to sleep with your window open, but some people don't mind it. And if that's the case, then that's not really a problem. But loud pumps and generators and lights are other things that we know are can reduce avian reproduction. So kind of avoiding these things could generally help them just do better. But there's no set density or optimal number of nest boxes. It's really, the goal is really to focus on creating a network of nest boxes that supports a breeding population of owls. So start with something reasonable. You can do sort of a rollout where you're putting up a few boxes this year, monitoring them, seeing if they get used. And, you know, once you see that they're being used, start adding more. You never want your barn owl nest boxes to be 100% full with nests. That means that you need more. You really want to see about 60 to 80% occupancy, because that'll allow for owls to switch nests, to re-nest. It also provide roosting habitat and safety for them. So if you see 100% occupancy, it's time to start adding more nest boxes. So barn owl nest box design does matter. You want to look for nest boxes that have that are about 24 inches in height on the front here. And that's because the hole can be placed closer to the top, so that will prevent nestlings from falling out when they're too young. They're vulnerable. They would, if they fall out of the nest box, they would most likely die from predators. And we can prevent that by keeping these holes up close to the top. And as pellets begin to build up, we want to make sure that we're keeping that floor pretty low. And so with a 24-inch high nest box, as opposed to somewhere like 16 or 18 inches, you have more time for that nest box to fill up. So it could be a little bit easier to manage. Heat is really important to keep track of, or keep in mind if you are in the Central Valley or in areas where the heat regularly exceeds 90 degrees. You want to make sure that you have these sunshade panels face your boxes north or east, and there's even some ventilation holes that helps with airflow and things that can help the nestlings. So going back to timing, so because we know a little bit about when barn owls are using these nest boxes, can inform when we visit them to do our maintenance. And because they are starting to pick out those nest boxes and kind of hold territory for that over them in the winter, we want to get to those nest boxes before that time, so we can make sure that they're safe and that they're cleaned out. So visiting nest boxes in fall months, late summer or fall, is less likely to disturb nesting pairs, and it'll prevent owls from starting nests in overfilled or unsafe boxes. Yeah, so the strategy here is not kind of like a set it and forget it. It's still going to take a consistent effort. It takes money and time to make sure that these nest boxes stay safe and effective. And so I recommend an annual inventory for cleaning and maintenance. You don't necessarily need to clean them out every single year if that pellet debris hasn't built up, but in smaller boxes, that will build up after one nest. So visiting those boxes every fall to clean out. And so one difference between songbird nest box and owl and kestrel nest boxes are that songbird nest boxes, you would clean everything out and leave it empty, whereas barn owls and kestrels, they need kind of a floor with debris on it because they don't build any sort of nest. We can't have like a flat surface where those eggs are going to be rolling around. So we need to have either leave some of the pellets and debris that's in there, but just lowered down, or replacing it with some non-treated wood chips. And then especially barn owl nest boxes, they're full of that rodent fur and dust from their pellets. And so it is smart to wear an N95 mask so you're not breathing any of that in. And some places offer services for cleaning, for installing, for maintenance. This in Sonoma County and Napa County, you have this Bombco resource. They offer services. There's other independent companies that offer services for cleaning and that sell nest boxes. And then you can also visit my website here to look up nest box plans if you're interested in building them yourself. So yeah, so the other thing that's really great about the BOMP program is that they keep really good records of who's used the box, and then they will clean and maintain those boxes. But if you're not having a service do that, I recommend people to kind of keep records. So are owls nesting in your boxes? How often? Which ones? And that can help you inform future strategies. So that's always important for IPM. And then really quickly, I know we're getting over time, but I have a couple of slides on raptor habitat and perches. So this is going to promote other raptors that don't use nest boxes. So hawks and other owls will nest in trees. And so having and preserving those large trees preserves nesting substrate for those birds. And seeking regional specific advice is important, so you know you're not planting an invasive tree. And there's also some interesting research showing that, you know, increasing that habitat on field margins is not going to increase pest damage necessarily by rodents. So increasing woody field margins can attract beneficial species and be beneficial overall. So that includes beneficial species like raptors. Perches can be a great tool if you don't have large trees, or you know that take a long time to grow. If you are thinking of planting large trees, so you want to provide something in the meantime, or out in the open, out in the middle of fields, perches can be really effective. They will attract a variety of diurnal and nocturnal raptor species to use these perches. And they're going to be a lot easier to construct and maintain than barn owl nest boxes, because you can use a really thin pole and then just like about an 18-inch piece of wood somehow attached to it. It can be made, you know, with things that you just have on hand. You want to aim to get those about 15 feet high. So often, you know, setting those into a hole with concrete, or using a fence post can be, attaching them to existing fence posts can be an effective way to implement raptor perches. But you want to use these in areas that are open, treeless. They don't already have perches. They don't already have telephone lines or telephone poles or power poles. And you want to place them in the highest area. So if you have like a hilltop or a ridge, or in the center of a really open area, those are where perches are going to be used the most often. And here are just a few, I'll end with a few pictures of perches. And here we go. This is kind of like a ridge line. So there's perches all across this ridge line, and raptors love to use thermals and wind to reduce their energy expenditure. And so they're often hanging out by these types of features. And so adding perches is a way to help them, you know, hunt from these areas as well. This one, I think that is effective maybe now, but I think as these trees grow larger and are taller, become taller than this, you know, you can move this to another area or even make it taller. And then this is an example of attaching a perch to a fence post. And barn owl boxes make really great raptor perches. And they're often out in the open as well. So, you know, that's just another way to leverage your resources if you want to do a mix of barn owl nest boxes and raptor perches. And then lastly, I just have a short little plug for a program that I'm working on now. We're starting to in Napa and Solano County, so it's probably not everybody here. We're starting a Kestrel Nest Box Network. And so if you're interested in that, that's something that you can contact me about, and I can help you get started with Kestrel Nest Boxes. So thank you. My website's here if you have any questions and resources that I shared that you can't find on my website. You can always email me, and I'd be happy to share those as well. So yeah, that's all I have today.
Thank you so much. Thank you both, Roger and Brianna. I really appreciate it. I learned a lot. I'm more of a plant and soil scientist, so this was very informative to me. I hope it was informative to everyone else too. So now we're gonna move into the panel section. So we have quite a few panelists here today, and I'm thinking we can start by going one by one with everyone on the panel for the first question. So the first question that I'm hoping everyone can answer in as much or as little depth as you feel like going into. The first question is just if you could please introduce yourself, share the name of your farm or where you work, and share a bit about which rodent IPM strategies you found work best in your experience. And I'm going to put that in the chat in case you need a reminder. So who would like to start? I can volunteer someone if that's easier. Claire, would you like to start
I can
us
go.
off? Okay, great. And then when you're done, if you could just popcorn over, choose the next person, and then we'll move
Great.
along. Thanks.
Cool. Hi, I'm Claire Reisman. I work at Santa Rosa Junior College Schoen Farm. I've been here for 2+ years, was at UC Santa Cruz before that. I was just making a list, and actually I appreciated just the most recent presentation because we are enrolled in the barn owl maintenance program. And so we've got 5. I was like scrambling through my emails, like how many owl boxes do we have? So we have 5, and it seems like relatively successful in terms of like 80% occupancy usually. So that was very cool. For gophers, cinch traps have been my go-to for many years, and just kind of, the best fertilizer or best IPM is the farmer's footsteps and just walking around the farm as much as possible, and trapping. And then we've had a really bad ground squirrel problem that came to a head this year. And so we started using have-a-heart traps, and I'm happy to talk more about using those. And then we also were having big mouse problems in our high tunnel with like seedlings just getting mowed down, and like good old Victor mouse traps were our best approaches there. So that's a quick rundown, and would be excited to go into more later. And I'll pass to Emma.
Hi, my name is Emma Torbert. I work at the UC Davis Student Farm, and I'm the market garden manager and educator there. We have like a 20-acre educational farm, and there's a bunch of different programs. I work mostly in the market garden, which is kind of like the farm section, but we also have eco garden and multiple sections of the farm, all of which have lots of rodents. We have all the different kinds of rodents everywhere. And yeah, we do a lot of different strategies. I wouldn't say we're winning the war, but we have grounds. Our main pest that causes the most damage is definitely ground squirrels, and we do trapping. We use perk or like fumigation machines in the non-organic areas. So like we have our like border areas, we're allowed to use a fumigation machine, which is like just carbon dioxide and monoxide that gets pumped into the burrows. We also have used like smoke bombs in those outside surrounding areas. But inside where the certified organic areas, we mostly do trapping. We do some habitat modification. We also have a number, we have a good red fox population, which, we try to, maintain. And I'm not sure, they seem to just mostly eat the squirrels once we've caught them. Not actually eat the squirrel, but catch the squirrels themselves. But we have a number of owl boxes, and Brianna gave 2 of her design to the student farm. And so we have a number of owl boxes up, and we have a good number of raptors as well. And we find gopher snakes as little as they're doing. That's pretty much all we could get into more of those, but I'll pass it to Joe.
Oh, Joey, I think you're muted.
Hi, can you hear me? Good. Okay. So hi, I'm Joe, or Joey Pater. I own Soda Canyon Farm. I've been doing it for about 5 years now, or 5 seasons. We have every pest except squirrels. We don't have ground squirrels. They're nearby, but they my property's pretty open. We have a lot of predators and hawks and owls, so they don't dare come over here. But Probably my favorite trap is the Maccabee. I really like the pincher trap. I mean it's old. It's been around forever. It's stood the test of time. You know, it works really well. So we use that one. But I've also been using the Gopher Hawk for a couple years now, and I really like it. The ease of use of it, you can really just stick, you probe the ground, you stick it in the ground, and it's good to go. And then yeah, it even has the indicator that pops up so you can see it if it's caught something, which is very nice. So I would say the Maccabee's probably more effective, but there's a lot more involved with that. You have to get in there and get into the tunnel. And I've also found they really like to just cover it with dirt half the time, which is pretty frustrating. You do all that work and you don't get anything. But yeah, I guess I'll pass it on to Carolyn.
Hi, everyone. I'm another human wildlife interactions advisor at UC A&R, but just from Sonoma down to Santa Clara and Santa Cruz. And definitely down on the peninsula, I would say ground squirrels are the biggest issue we face. And then, for home gardens, rats, and really trapping and fumigation for the non-organic properties, but otherwise it's been mostly trapping. And for ground squirrels, it's, live traps. And then for gophers, definitely the cinch traps. So we typically use Maccabees, Gophinators, and have good luck with those.
Yeah, those are all great.
Brianna and Roger, do you want to add anything? I realize we might not have introduced your title, so if you'd like to tell us your title, that would be great.
Yeah, sure. I guess I'll go first. Roger Baldwin. I'm a corporate extension specialist at UC Davis, where I focus on human wildlife conflict issues, mostly in ag and natural resource areas. You can probably tell from my presentation today that the Gophinator for gopher trapping is my preferred tool. In fact, I think it's one of the preferred tools even in conventional ag systems. It's just really, really effective. And one of the great things about trapping is always the fact that you've caught the gopher and got rid of it, as opposed to burrow fumigants or rodenticide baiting or whatnot, where certainly there are techniques you can monitor to determine how overall effective you were, but it's just not quite the same as having the gopher in hand and knowing that you've been successful on that front. For voles, man, I hate working with voles. They're really challenging because of their reproductive capabilities. In theory, a female vole could reproduce 11 times in 1 year. It doesn't happen quite like that, but it's nothing for them to have 4 or 5 litters per year. And when you start to look at exponential growth, man, they can just really overpopulate an area quite rapidly when conditions get right. And so that kind of, in those settings, it takes trapping away in a lot of cases. In an organic production systems, if you don't have trapping and you already don't have rodenticides or burrow fumigants as an option, it really doesn't leave a whole lot left. So my least favorite phone calls to take are from growers who are organic producers who have mold problems, because oftentimes I don't have a good answer for them.
Hi again, I'm Brianna Martinico, and I am also a UC Cooperative Extension Advisor working with human wildlife interactions, and I cover Napa, Lake, and Solano counties. Most of my background is working with birds on farms, and so I don't have a favorite trap. I rely a lot on Roger and Carolyn for information about making IPM plans that include trapping, but I will say for barn owl nest boxes and for kestrel nest boxes and raptor perches, I have talked to a variety of people who do find that over time it is effective for them. It does help reduce their rodent populations in their area. Not to say that it works perfectly everywhere, but you know, there are a lot of people who do swear by it and say and talk about how beneficial it is for them. So that's really what my experience is in as part of rodent management, is encouraging raptors. So yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, and I appreciate it too, Roger, what you mentioned about habitat modification and clearing space where you can to make, you know, the area less hospitable to rodents. I know I talked to Peter Martinelli at Freshman Farm in Marin County, who was unable to be here on the panel. I invited him, but he's not here today. But one of the things he mentioned, and he said I could share it with everyone, is that that is also a big part of what he does, is trying to keep, you know, the environment less hospitable by clearing out areas. He also mentioned quite a bit about predators, natural predators, and I actually took notes on our phone conversation and put it on my website. So I'll put a link to that in the chat. But for the folks here, I love to go around and hear more about anecdotes, you know, stories that you have that you feel were good learning moments or successes you've had around natural predators. Trapping, if you'd like. We kind of already covered trapping, so I'm thinking maybe we could focus on predators, habitat modification, anything else you feel like, you know, maybe hasn't been brought up yet. Yeah, would love to hear about anecdotes, and we can.
I would like to add, we haven't really touched on cats at all. I think, you know, they're like everyone else has said, it's just one tool in the toolbox that you use. I'd also like to add, I'm only on 1 acre market garden type thing situation, so it's pretty small scale. And my 2 cats do a great job. Like ever since I got them 2 years ago, I really haven't had a bolt problem whatsoever. And like Roger said, you know, it is very like up and down with the seasons and with the months and what's available for them to eat and how their habitat is doing. But if you have the ability to host a cat or have a cat, they make a great you know, partner for getting down your populations. I also wanted to say there's a few questions in the questions and answers. I don't know if you guys saw that. It's not in the webinar chat, but if you click on the Q&A, okay, you saw it.
Yeah, we can answer some of those if you like. I'm wondering, yeah, maybe I'll go through the Q&A real quick and sort of summarize key points that we could sort of try to touch on. One was from Rod, just about encouraging barn owls. I think that was before Brianna discussed that. But let us know if there's more you want us to cover on that. Another comment from Jenny Trotter, I think specifically for Roger, and we're asking, let's see, would it be better to do like multiple days in a row of setting traps versus, you know, one day of lots of traps and then 2 weeks later, like you said, coming back. So maybe could you touch on that briefly?
Yeah, absolutely. So what I recommend in a situation like that is to try to thoroughly, if you're going to use trapping as a tool and your goal is to greatly reduce gopher populations in that area and keep them low for an extended period of time, my suggestion is to trap heavily in that area, a couple of trapping sessions throughout the entire area, and that should presumably, let's see, half-acre blocks. Okay, so that's something that you can reasonably do in a pretty short period of time. So I would try to trap out those areas pretty extensively, get you down to the point where you're close to zero for gophers. Then once you're at that point, then it becomes a matter of just carrying a few traps in your vehicle or, you know, whatever you use. And whenever you see a new gopher mound pop up, then you can, you know, go ahead and set traps and try to remove it right away. Keep those populations at low levels once you've got them down to low levels so that they stay that way. Otherwise, you know, if you fall asleep at the wheel, so to speak, for 6 months or a year, those populations are going to rebound pretty quickly through reinvasion. and you're going to deal, have to go back through with an extensive trapping program again, which is more time consuming. So ideally, you will be able to knock those populations down extensively initially, and then just use maintenance trapping from there on. I hope that answered the question.
Thanks. Yeah. And then I'm wondering, it looks like we have a couple questions about owls specifically. So where else do they nest? Do they nest in trees? And also Jenny was saying if, you put a nest box up, she's heard maybe you're actually helping your neighbors because they have a pretty large range. So wondering about range and if they'll be effective, like right next to their nest box location.
Yeah, so barn owls are cavity nesters. They will nest in large trees that have cavities that are large enough. So they could be nesting in an oak tree. But oftentimes, other owls nesting in trees are great horned owls, and they are going to be using old nests. So they could use an old raptor nest or an old squirrel nest. They're not going to be building their nest, but they will kind of be up more in the branches. So if you know your tree doesn't have any, large cavities that you could see, it could possibly be a barn or a great horned owl. And another good way to tell is to listen to barn owl calls and great horned owl calls online and hear what they sound like. So the barn owls actually do this large, long screech, and great horned owls do hooting. So if your owl is hooting, then that's going to definitely be a great horned owl. And if it's doing this kind of screech that sounds crazy, then that's a barn owl. Barn owls also do some clicking and some other softer sounds. So you can Google that and find all sorts of recordings so you can listen. And then in terms of barn owls' range, yes, they have really large ranges, and it varies by owls. It depends on where they are, the habitat they're in, and they can travel 4 kilometers regularly from their nest box, and that's not a problem to them, just even provisioning young. But what happens is as they're flying over and back into that nest box, even if they're not hunting directly right from that nest box, they're still there. So it's still going to influence rodent behavior in that area. So it will still be beneficial to you to have an active barn owl nest box. But yeah, they may not be depleting those rodents through direct consumption on your property. It kind of depends. And so thinking about it as kind of a larger regional approach and a network of boxes that can promote a healthy population of owls, a resilient population of owls, is kind of how I like to sell nest box networks. So if you're in a smaller scale type of farm situation, talking to your neighbors and other people in your area to get them to put up nest boxes too can be beneficial. So that's, that's all I have on that.
Awesome, thanks. Okay, so I put some questions in the chat that were from the registration survey. So these questions are coming from folks who registered. So I'm wondering if we can go around, hear from Claire, Joey, Carolyn, and Emma around any of these. Don't feel like you have to answer all of them, but anecdotes or tips about preventing predators. Maybe if you have any experience around you finally got rid of the rodents, but then you have these empty tunnels. How do you prevent new ones from coming in? Would love to hear some anecdotes from growers. So who would like to start?
I could start.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay. Okay, so anecdotes about tips to promote predators. I think the barn owl boxes at my previous farm, the barn owl boxes were very effective. Our ones that we put up are pretty recent. We're actually going to go survey and see if there's owls in them this spring. So it'll be interesting to see the effect they have because they're pretty new. But in the past, I've had good luck with putting barn owl boxes up, especially for like mice and gopher, like smaller rodent populations. And, you know, we had the best luck in like spots that were kind of open right by like kind of like our citrus grove. Those boxes always seem to be more occupied. So there was like an open side and then like some small trees nearby. So, and, you know, for the foxes that we have, like one thing that we try to do is not to have an area where we don't disturb them. And especially when they have their young, when we see the cubs, to like have periods where we're not doing tractor work right near their den. And I'm not sure beyond that, we would like to have more predators. We do have some feral cats that, you know, are hopefully helping out, and we encourage those. And in terms of, we have done some like disking, and since I've been there, we haven't done deep ripping, but that is something that we've considered doing, is doing deep ripping after, you know, doing a big kind of like trapping effort, or in the non-organic areas, if you fumigate and think you are effective, then, you know, doing some deep ripping to get those tunnels to be filled in. We do, you know, like I'd say about twice a year, we go through and cover all the tunnels to try to see like where are the active ones. So we're trying to like really understand where our main populations of squirrels are. Yeah, Joe, do you want to go?
Yeah, for promoting predators, the owl boxes are probably the best. And you know, they're natural, and you let the predators do the work for you once they move in. They put in a lot of work, and promoting them to your property can be kind of difficult. You really want like an equilibrium with nature, and try, you know, if you're having an overabundance of a certain pest, there's a reason for that. And trying to get to that reason will definitely bring you to a solution. You know, making sure there's not a lot of overabundance of food for them. And it can be hard because, you know, gophers, they like the root crops, and if you're growing a bunch of carrots, well, that's going to be, you know, a five-star hotel for them down there. Um, um, for my cats, you know, I have two cats, and and I see someone here said, what's you don't want to, oh, songbird population. Yeah. So, you know, you want to make sure you're not feeding your cats too much, and very little, actually. You can Google how much to feed them, and you really want to feed them maybe a quarter to half of that, and maybe even less, you know, and keep an eye on them. If they're looking a little skinny, you could feed them more. But if they're hunting songbirds, it means you're feeding them too much, because when cats are hunting for food, they're going to go after mammals more often than not, because they're more nutritious, have more fat on them. So keep that in mind. Um, the coyotes are great too. You really kind of want to, yeah, not scare them off, and just keep, you know, keep everything in an equilibrium where everything's working well for you and not against you. And that can be really hard with nature sometimes, I know. But you can get there on your farm, or in your garden, definitely. Does someone else want to take the floor?
I might chime in here real quick on something. I had a feeling this would probably pop up at some point. So the whole concept of cats for rodent control. There's no doubt cats can be pretty efficient hunters of rodents, and can be pretty successful at keeping rodent populations at relatively low levels. But we have to be cautious about about them because they do have a high propensity for feeding on a lot of non-target wildlife. And there's a lot of research out there that's shown massive detrimental impacts from feral cats on songbird populations, on herps, lizards, salamanders, things like that. So I don't personally have an issue with somebody utilizing a cat, close to their home or whatnot for general rodent control. But what I want to caution against is releasing a bunch of cats in a particular area for rodent control. And that is done in some cases. I've heard about that. And that's not the direction we want to go, because that will lead to, in all likelihood, a rapid depopulation of songbird populations and other non-target wildlife as well. So be very cautious as to how cats are used for rodent control. Again, I think 1 or 2 barn cats, so to speak, around your house, probably okay, but I wouldn't go much beyond that.
Thanks, Claire and Carolyn. Did you have any predator thoughts or anecdotes?
I can pop in. So I'm afraid I don't have like positive anecdotes on the predator front in terms of coyotes. I mean, some of the areas I work with have a lot of coyotes and they still have really big ground squirrel problems. So I always encourage people to, you want predators using your space, but there's only so much they're going to do as part of your integrated program. I was going to touch on the next question about, once you have reduced rodent populations, what then to prevent reinvasion? And that's really where I always encourage people to try to have a continual plan, right? You don't want to just go through, do one big knockdown, and then leave it for a few years, because you're going to end up right back where you started. And really just having that maintenance plan going forward to try to keep the rodent population at a low level is going to end up paying off in the long run. But I know so many people, it's like I hear from them a few years later and they're like, the problem's back. It's like, well, what have you been doing? Well, nothing. And so just really encourage you to try to keep a maintenance plan. And it's a good thing if you're only seeing, a few of them, right? You want that to keep happening, but just don't get too relaxed about it. And so like Roger's suggestion of keeping a few gopher traps in your car, as you see new mounts, that mentality of just trying to pounce on it as soon as you see any signs of reinvasion.
Yeah, I think a huge part of trapping in general is just the diligency of getting out there and actually doing it. And it can be hard sometimes, but you gotta trap them. You gotta get those traps out.
I also similarly don't have a lot of anecdotes to share about predators. I see a lot of coyote scat around, and it's near where the ground squirrels are getting in. So it doesn't seem to be the most effective management technique. But I wanted to grab one of the questions from the chat about attracting ground squirrels into traps or bait types and locations. To me, the location has been more effective in terms of finding where they're burrowing, and we'll periodically go through and like fill in the burrows to see which ones are active, like Emma was talking about before, and then isolate those burrows, and just with these have a heart traps, these long rectangular boxes, we'll just line them up right with where the opening of the burrow and try to bury the mesh of the box in. Usually there's wood chips around, but so the theory, I don't know if this is true, is that they don't like the feeling of the metal on their paws, so just try to mask the metal a bit. And I'm not even, what I would do, we had bigger issues with ground squirrels getting into our lettuce, which was really surprising this year. And I was joking that they like have great taste because they would eat the hearts of our little gem lettuces. So I'd make them a little salad and throw it into the box at the end of every day, and open the trap. And one caveat, the hard learned lesson, was to be checking the traps every day, because we had a weekend where the traps were I had left it open, and we ended up capturing unfortunately a raccoon, which died. So with the have a heart traps, they're only having a heart if you remember to check them every day. So just like a PSA to be on top of that. And yeah, so anyway, those are my recommendations on location and bait type. Whatever they're going for is sort of what I would put in the trap. So they were going after our watermelons, like cuts them up and throw them in there. Yeah, that's what I wanted to say.
Maybe I could chime in there because we also use the live traps. We use both the tube traps, which are like a kill type squirrel trap, and then the live traps. And at different points of year, it seems like one of the traps will be more effective than the other. So like often when it's cooler out, the tube traps seem to be more effective, and then when it's hotter out, the live traps seem to be more effective. And you do have to check them every day. Sometimes when it's really hot, twice a day. And like their bait preference changes over the season. So like late in the fall, like popcorn on the cob always seems to be really effective, or like nuts in the shell sometimes will be effective later in the season, whereas earlier, yeah, like something like tomatoes or squash or anything like that will be effective at other points of the year. Right now, I'm having a hard time figuring out what they'll eat. Because I think what I heard is that they do hibernate, but maybe like the ones that aren't hibernating are like the yearling ones. And Roger gave us, some tip that we're going to try this year, which is, we've been trying to trap, and he said we're cultivating, squirrel resistant traps, like squirrels that know about the traps, and then they are wise enough to be like, I'm going to avoid this trap. And so what our new strategy this year is going to be like to choose to have like very intensive sections of our farm that we trap, and try to leave the traps open for weeks at a time with bait in it, till they all get comfortable getting in the traps. And then on one night, try to trap every squirrel in that kind of region of the farm, and then switch to a different region. And I can let you know how that works. After this year, we're going to try it.
Yeah, I'll just jump in a little bit here too. Yeah, pre-baiting and it can be a really good strategy to increase efficacy there of a trapping program, like Emma said. And she did point out something that I wanted to make sure we pointed out too, and that is these traps do have to be checked daily. And yeah, if it's hot out, probably multiple times a day, because they will succumb to heat exposure within an hour or two in some of those hot environments. And of course, I think it's always important to point out too, if you catch an animal in a live trap, you are responsible for euthanizing the animal after capture. Translocation off property is not legal. It's against California Fish and Game Code. So you need to be prepared to euthanize the animal on site as well. There are two techniques really considered humane by the American Vet Association that would be appropriate in a situation like this, and those are shooting and the use of a carbon dioxide euthanasia chamber. But of course, for many of you, discharging a firearm where you're at may not be an option. So that leaves the carbon dioxide euthanasia chamber approach. So I just want to make sure that everybody is aware of that process before they start engaging in a live trapping program. You got to make sure that you have everything covered to be able to deal with that. And if anybody wants more information on that, I'd encourage them to check out the Ground Squirrel Best Management Practices website. That's groundsquirrelbmp.com. It's a UCANR publication that covers basically everything there is to know about managing ground squirrels, including the use of a carbon dioxide euthanasia chamber. And then very quickly, I would also just hit on something that Emma mentioned, because one of the questions is how do you, once you get rid of the rodents, how do you keep them from coming back? One of the tools that can be used is deep ripping, like Emma said. That destroys old burrow systems. And a colleague of mine did a study years ago that found that when they removed ground squirrels from an area and then destroyed those old burrow systems, that greatly reduced reinvasion rates by ground squirrels. The key, though, is you do have to get deep. It has to be 1.5 feet in depth. 1 foot was not enough, so you truly have to have a ripper out there to destroy those old burrow systems. It hasn't actually been tested on gophers, but I suspect that it probably is pretty consistent with gopher populations as well.
Thanks, Roger. I saw too, there's a question, around what are all of the other options besides trapping? And actually yesterday I was at a farm and grower mentioned, their fields are pretty soggy still, and it's really not conducive to trapping. So for various different reasons, if we were to just sort of list like bullet point summary of all of the other IPM strategies, I know you covered them. You both covered them a lot in your PowerPoint presentations, but just, try to address that question. If you could maybe just list them real quick, that would be great. I mean, starting with habitat modification, so clearing it out, making sure there's less cover for them. We've got natural predators, of course. Ripping if you need to. Of course, some farmers are also no-till, so that's only an option if, you're using tillage practices. But of course, frequency matters, so maybe you just disc once when you really, really need to. So there's some middle ground there in some cases for those folks who are reduced till, but maybe not no-till. Are there other things I'm missing?
No, I mean, that's most of it. You have to keep in mind though, so some of these tools are long term or the long game, like Brianna was saying. So, if you have a vole outbreak or a gopher outbreak now, putting up barn owl boxes tomorrow isn't going to solve your problem, right? That's for 1 to 2 to 3 years down the road. Excuse me. Same thing goes to some extent for habitat modification, although in some cases there's some things that can be done that will have short-term benefits, hopefully. So let's say you have vole problems and you have weed barrier cloth. Ripping up the weed barrier cloth is going to cause a lot of voles to start scurrying everywhere. So it may provide you some short-term relief there. Same thing with mowing vegetation low. I'm trying to think of some of the other tools, soil tillage, deep ripping. Might get rid of a few gophers short term. Again, that's probably more of a longer term solution. Exclusion, if it's vole damage, you can utilize the trunk protectors for newly planted trees, and that's probably something that can have an impact right away. For gophers, though, there's not a whole lot that can be done on the exclusion side of things. But yeah, it's true. I mean, when you get wet soils, relatively anoxic, the critters just start hanging out in those spots. They move to higher ground where it's not so wet.
Yeah, this is also making me wonder, does anyone have like preferred record keeping methods? You have like a little notebook where you write things down with rodents, where you're seeing them, where you put traps, how many, when, what time of year. Do you have like favorite monitoring tools, even if it's just a little notepad?
I use those little metal they're just little flags. They're little metal wires with the flag on them to mark where I trap. And that's as for record keeping, I'm not the best, but for marking and keeping track of where everything is, I use those.
One thing that I didn't mention in terms of that could help with record keeping, it's not really, how are you going to write it down, but to look for activity in barn owl boxes, if you're just wondering if they're being used, look along the opening, along the bottom side of that for scratches, because a lot of barn owl boxes that don't have perches on the front, they're going to rely on landing and their talons are going to hook into those grooves in the top edge of that opening. And so that can get worn down over time. So you could see use that way. You can also look on the ground for pellets and rodent skulls and bones and things like that. And so that's an easy way to kind of just throughout the year, see if owls are using your boxes.
One comment I wanted to make for that question, Ziegler was asking, we were just talking about methods other than trapping for gophers. I think his question might have been more towards deterring gophers, and you could try using the castor oil. I haven't had much success with that, but you could try that if you're not trying to kill anything.
Yeah, for record keeping, you know, I think for organic, we have to keep like a natural resources log, and I'd say we do an okay job of that. We definitely are putting some of the things that we observe in that log. And that is like, I think, you know, with the students at the farm, it is a fun thing. Like, you know, we encourage people to take pictures of things they're seeing and then like put it in that log, and I don't know. It is like a very interactive part of the farm for students. And we do use those flags to mark gopher traps. And we also do, we have a whiteboard where we mark them because we do have multiple group, you know, just for our situation, we have different people setting traps and we're trying to keep track of where they are. So we use a whiteboard just to mark where they are on the farm. In terms of like other things other than trapping, like for squirrels at least, one thing that we're trying this year is like trying to choose different varieties. We had a big problem with a lot of our winter squash getting eaten by ground squirrels last year. And so we heard that there's some kind of hard rind winter squash that might be more resistant to squirrel damage. So we're trying different variety selection in certain places. We do a lot of like thinking about where on the farm is the worst damage, and then trying to choose what we plant based, you know, like there's certain things like onions and garlic that aren't as squirrel problematic, but they're more gopher problematic. So trying to choose which area of our farm to plant which crop to reduce the amount of damage. I think other things that we have tried, we have done like physical barriers for the squirrels. That did seem to work this last year for our sweet potatoes. Like the squirrels, when the sweet potatoes are just starting, they can tend to mow them at the student farm. And so if we put up a fence around that area, so it's a double fence because we have a big fence on the outside with squirrels are all in it. Then we put another fence just around the sweet potatoes, and that seemed to get the sweet potatoes far enough along that like the squirrels didn't cause enough damage to really set them back. So there are some other techniques that we're trying other than trapping. We are also like, you know, this year we did a lot of pruning of our trees to make sure that like not as many of our trees are like creating as much habitat lower to the ground. So that's another habitat modification.
Nice, that's great to hear about. And yeah, with that, what you mentioned about the smaller double fence reminded me of the photos in Roger's PowerPoint where you have some form of, you know, physical barrier. It might not, you know, totally reduce populations or keep them out 100%, but it sounds like slow them down to some degree and help. So I feel like this is all of these, you know, stories and tips, I feel like are really good illustration of integrated pest management, where you're not going to just use one thing, but integrate lots of different strategies, you know, the ones that make sense for you in your context. Yeah, and I also just remember too, Roger mentioned, I think this will be really relevant for a lot of my growers who are using cover crops, thinking about cover crop selection and not going for the ones with, you know, big tap roots or that are nitrogen fixers. If you can, trying to rotate that at least, or, you know, if you know you have, you know, pretty severe gopher pressure, going for something with more fibrous root system. So I like what you said, Emma, about like thinking about crop selection and location based on, you know, thinking through your records. It sounds like that's also relevant for cover crops as well. Yeah, any other thoughts, Carolyn or Claire or anybody?
I'll quickly just answer the one question in the Q&A about see a garden in a public park with mole gopher issues and being worried about you know, the public accidentally stepping in the traps. And so that's really where cinch traps are going to be your friend, and then, you know, placing them in the burrow and then covering them back up. So as Roger mentioned, like, you know, it's not necessarily going to increase your efficacy for trapping, but it will then keep, you know, people from stepping on them if you do cover the whole backup where you've placed the cinch trap into the burrow system. And then you can think about pros and cons of, I mean, flagging is always better for being able to find your traps and keeping track of it, but I could see, considering whether that makes the most sense for your situation if it is in a public park.
Yeah, building on that question too, and what Carolyn said. If you're going to trap, and any of those pinch style traps like that would work in a situation like that. If you're going to do that, try to cut the piece of turf out in one clump, so you can pull it out, set it aside, put the traps in, and then put it back in. So it doesn't really look like anything's happened there, because otherwise, if you try to cover with like black canvas or something like we did in our study, people are going to go, oh, well, what's there? And they're going to start digging around and wonder what's going on there. So the more you can make it look like nothing's happened, the better off you'll be. I have seen some of the professional pest control companies, instead of using flagging, take spray paint and spray paint like a little X right in that area where the trap is, so that they can find it. So that's another potential option. The other option too is, and we see this a lot like here on campus, I see it a lot in other parks and golf courses and things like that now. This wouldn't work if you're organic, but if it's not an organic situation, then these pressurized exhaust machines are being used a lot in those kinds of settings, because it's kind of, you show up, you fumigate the burrow system. It's carbon monoxide. It's not something that, it's going to leak out of the burrow system and cause people to get sick. It's not like some of the other fumigants that are out there. So they can sit there, work through an area one time, knock down the population, and then, nobody really knows. So it's just a quicker, safer option for some people than trapping in those situations.
Thanks. Is there any other wisdom, anecdotes, tips, stories anyone would like to share?
There was a question about the food safety, and I think that is something, we also have to like if we see scat in the field, we have to make sure to not harvest in a perimeter around that area. And depending on what crop it is, it can be more of a problem. From our situation, the bigger problem for scat animal droppings is when you have a lot of especially if you have rats or anything like that. That is when we've had the most damage for like the amount of scat, and where we get worried about food safety. For the predators, I find so little in our fields that doesn't seem to cause as much. Like there's less area that we have to exclude. So for me, I'd rather have the predators.
Well, I have a quick question. Do we know if, let's go with gophers. Do we know if gophers prefer certain soil types? I mean, I'm assuming they'd prefer maybe like sandy soil. I don't have any evidence behind that, except it feels intuitive. Is that right? Or do they have preferences in environmental conditions besides soil type 2?
Was it a question for gophers?
Yeah, let's go with gophers. That's the one I've heard the most about from folks in this region. So yeah, let's go with gophers.
Well, in my personal endeavors, I've heard from farms in Sonoma where there's a lot more sand, that they have less problems with gophers. But I mean, I'm not sure if that's a true thing or not. I have like loam soil. It's not sandy soil, and I have a ton of gophers. So take what you will with that. I don't know. I have a friend who has a very sandy soil, and he doesn't have gophers at all. And I don't know if that's because of his soil structure or because of just where he is, so.
Yeah, I mean, I would second all of that. I think super sandy, not good. Super hard clay, not good. Loamy soils, we love it. So, and then there's of course a continuum in between of that. So, good soft soil that holds the burrow system structure. That's what they want.
That makes sense. Thanks. Any other questions I might have missed in the Q&A or anything else people want to add in? Okay, well, I realize it's 3:01, so I don't want to keep anyone. I'll hang out another 5-10 minutes for those who do want to stick around. But I don't want to hold anyone. If you've got to get going, I understand. So thank you all so much for being here. This is so informative. I really appreciate the expertise, your experience, your knowledge. I really appreciate it. This is a very new subject for me. So I learned a ton. I hope everyone else listening in learned a lot. If you do have questions that didn't get answered, please email me and I can pass them along to folks. I also have a survey. It's very short, I promise. It's an evaluation survey. If you could please just fill it out. It's just going to take maybe 1 minute. And that's going to give us some really helpful feedback. And that's just so helpful for me in terms of what you want to see. Was this effective? Do you want to see more of this sort of thing? Any feedback's good feedback. So please just take a moment, fill that out if you can. And with that, I think I'll just hang out and see if anyone else wants to stick around, share more stories. If not, if you gotta go, I totally understand. So thank you for your time.
Thanks, Ellie. Thanks for putting this together.
Definitely. Thanks for being
Have
here.
a good one.
You too.
Yeah. One thing I did mention, one of the questions I see on here, this is one Brianna could probably talk more about, but I think they're asking, do some barn owls predate on other species? And that gets into the great horned owl versus barn owl issue, which again, Brianna can expound on this, but my understanding is great horned owls equal no barn owls in that immediate adjacent area because they predate on them. But Brianna, do you want to expand on that?
Sure, yeah, it's a common question that we get. Great horned owls are the bully of the raptor species. They very pretty territorial, and they can depredate other raptor species, including barn owls. The owl, so they do coexist. They can nest in the same areas. And you're never going to probably find an area in California where there aren't great horned owls present. And so, there's not really much you can do in terms of if you have a great horned owl. But the best thing that you could do is get the larger size nest boxes that I was talking about, the 24-inch nest boxes, because the owl nestlings, right after they leave the nest box, that's when they're the most vulnerable. And so they tend to, and this is, kind of anecdotal, but also thought, they will leave the nest boxes a little bit earlier if the nest boxes are crammed, or there's more likely that they can fall out, like that's shown. But also the larger nest boxes that have more space, they can do more exercising of their wings and kind of get more coordination before they leave the box. It won't be the first time that they really spread their wings. So the larger nest boxes have more space, and those nestlings might get more strength and experience before they leave the nest box. And that could help them be protected a little bit more from if a great horned owl were to come into the area. And yeah, the other thing you could think about is like when putting your barn owl boxes up, maybe you don't want to put it like right under a tree, but you could put it near a tree or like in vineyards near the vines, so that when the owls do leave the box, they have some sort of cover nearby. So you don't want to like place it within a woodland or in a forest, but other things nearby habitat wise are going to also benefit those nestling owls when they're or those fledgling owls when they're the most vulnerable to great horned owl predation. Yeah, so I think they coexist. So if you hear a great horned owl, you might have less success getting an owl in a nest box that year, but I would still put up owl nest boxes if you have great horned owls. Yeah, I don't know if there's if anyone else has experience with that, so.
I was going to say thank you so much, Ellie. I don't have so much experience with that, but I really appreciated the webinar. So thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for being here. Okay, I guess we'll wrap up. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much, everyone. Please don't hesitate to reach out. And have a great afternoon.
See you all later.
Bye.